chain smoke, and I say fuck all. When I accept myself for the way I am, I accept you too.
CR and Crimes Against Humanity. In my last two videos, PCR and Crimes Against Humanity, I'll leave links. We talk about Kary Mullis, Nobel Prize winner that invented the PCR, which is what we use for COVID tests today.
If they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. To test for that one and say that has any special meaning is what I think is the problem. Not that PCR has been misused. It allows you to take a very minuscule amount of anything and make it measurable and then talk about it in meetings and stuff like it is important. See, that's not a misuse, that's just sort of a misinterpretation.
And how he conveniently passed away August of 2019, not long before this outbreak. So I don't know if you heard about the whole HIV debate that was going on back in the 80s, 90s.
California microbiologist Dr. Kary Mullis was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993 for his development of one of the most widely used current techniques in molecular biology today, the PCR, or polymerase chain reaction.
Dr. Kary Mullis, who invented the polymerase chain reaction, gives this in '83, I believe, and he got the Nobel Prize in 1993, gives this little story that he was hired to do PCR for an HIV project for a private company, and he wrote as the first sentence of his paper, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS, and he said he turned to a virologist and said, what's the reference for that? And the virologist said, you don't need it. Well, Mullis is smart enough to know, of course, something new as this, you would always have a series of original papers that established unequivocally that this was the cause.
The first time I really questioned it, I was working on a project where we were measuring HIV in people's blood at this place called Specialty Laboratories in Santa Monica. I was just a consultant there. And I came in about 3 days a month, and we were working on that. And at some point, we needed to re-up our grant from the NIH to work on that, and I had to write it. And so the first line of that was HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I wrote that, and then I said, well, I need a paper, some kind of scientific paper, to reference that statement. Because when you make a scientific statement like that, that's like a fact. So you need to say, here's how come I know that, right? You put a little one if it's the first statement you've made, and then you put down at the bottom of the paper you have a one, and you say, here's a paper by somebody that describes why that statement's true, right? And so I said, well, what's that? I don't know. I mean, I think about, what is that paper? Who do I go to for that? And I looked around, I asked a couple of virologists at that company, and they said, no, you don't have to reference. I said, I have to reference that because I don't know where that came from. How do I know that? And it turned out that nobody knew it. Then, and only then, I started looking into it. I looked up a bunch of papers in Science that about Gallo. I knew about him and had written. I figured, well, Gallo must have been the one to figure it out because he's the name I've heard associated with it. And I looked at his papers, and I didn't find anything in there that actually showed me that there was a fact now in science called HIV is the cause of AIDS, or even the probable cause of AIDS, which is all I would have expected, the probable cause of AIDS. Highly probable, because they were attacking the whole problem by then as though it were certainly the cause. So I'd expect it to be highly probable, but I couldn't find anything that said it was remotely probable even. There is no reference. There is nobody who should get credit for that statement. And that's a pretty weird situation in science, where getting credit for a discovery is the most important thing in your life. And so I asked all these people one after the other, and none of them had it. None of them. And I was getting really freaked about that. That's when I first started saying, they don't know. Nobody really knows. This whole thing is a big sham. It's ridiculous. How much money did we make off of HIV this year? And they could have plotted that, and it would have looked the same. You know, and they could have said it's an epidemic because we're making more and more money. That made it a plague, and the CDC needed one. The CDC hadn't had a good plague since polio. Their funding was probably going to be cut back if they didn't come up with one. The guy that was the head of the CDC, in fact, wrote memos that have been obtained, that where he describes this as hot stuff. Those guys have got an agenda, which is not what we would like them to have, being that we pay for them to take care of our health in some way. The scientists are, like you say, they are considered the final arbiters of what's good for the planet or what's bad for the planet. And they haven't got the slightest idea. Instead of wearing white robes, they wear white lab coats, Instead of bringing you the word of God, they bring you the word of the EPA. I was right at the edge of my faith in the system, but I thought Montagnier will know why he thinks HIV causes it, and he'll tell me. He'll say, because of this study. But he didn't have that. None of those guys have that. And that's why they're so weird, That's why they don't want to say. They don't want people like me walking up and asking them those kind of questions. And they're willing to go to great lengths to prevent that. They're out on a limb. I wouldn't want to be there with them. Where if somebody gets mad at you for asking them a question in a scientific meeting, or says, we're never going to have Kary Mullis at the European Union of whatever kind of scientists, or they put it in Nature, because he came in there and had the audacity to tell people that it might not be that bad to have sex. That AIDS might not be something you get from sex. That I don't see any evidence for it is all I said. I don't see any evidence for it. What? You can't tell young people that.
This is from Spin, July 1994, by Celia Farber. When ABC's Nightline approached Mullis about participating in a documentary on himself, he instead urged them to focus their attention on the HIV debate. Quote, "That's a much more important story," he told the producers, who up till that point had never acknowledged the controversy. In the end, Nightline ran a two-part series, the first part on Kary Mullis, the second on the HIV debate. Mullis was hired by ABC for a 2-week period to act as their scientific consultant and direct them to sources. The show was superb and represented a historic turning point, possibly even the end of the 7-year media blackout on the HIV debate. But it still didn't fulfill Mullis's ultimate fantasy. Quote, "What ABC needs to do is talk to Chairman of the NIAID, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and Dr. Robert Gallo, one of the discoverers of HIV, and show that they're assholes, which I could do in 10 minutes. You wouldn't even need 10 minutes, but the interviewer points out that Gallo will refuse to discuss the HIV debate, just as he's always done. I know he will," Mullis shoots back, anger rising in his voice, "but you know what? I would be willing to chase the little bastard from his car to his office and say, 'This is Kary Mullis, trying to ask you a goddamn simple question,' and let the cameras follow. If people think I'm a crazy person, that's okay. But here's a Nobel Prize winner trying to ask a simple question from those who spent $22 billion and killed 100,000 people. It has to be on TV. It's a visual thing. I'm not unwilling to do something like that." Referring to the guardians of the HIV establishment, such as Gallo and Fauci, Mullis suddenly turns from rage to pity. "I feel sorry for him," he admits. "I want to have the story unveiled, but you know what? I'm just not the kick him in the balls kind of guy. I'm a moral person, but I'm not a crusader. I think it's a terrible tragedy that it's happened. There are some terrible motivations of humans involved in this, and Gallo and Fauci have got to be some of the worst."
AZT is an antiretroviral drug that became the first drug approved for the treatment of AIDS and HIV infection in 1987. It was originally intended to treat cancer, but it failed to show efficacy and had unacceptably high side effect profiles. However, the unavailability at that time for alternatives to treat AIDS affected the risk-benefit ratio greatly.
The antiviral drugs are chemotherapies. They're all based on chemotherapies that have been developed 30 years ago, long before AIDS was known, to kill human cells. Chemotherapy is restricted to a few months and hope the cancer dies before you die.
If you started taking any other chemotherapeutic agent for the rest of your life, it would be that agent probably that killed you. When you give chemotherapy to somebody with cancer, you give them a round of it for maybe 14 days or a few days. Hopefully you're not going to kill the patient, you're going to kill the cancer. The patient's going to survive. But you don't keep giving it to him until he dies, because he certainly will.
From Spin, October 5th, 2015, AIDS and the AZT Scandal. Spin's 1989 feature, Sins of Omission, the story of AZT, one of the most toxic, expensive, and controversial drugs in the history of medicine. If AIDS were not the popular disease that it is, the money-making, career-making machine, these people could not get away with this kind of shoddy science, says Dr. Harvey Biley. In all my years in science, I have never seen anything this atrocious. When asked if he thought it was at all possible that people had been killed as a result of AZT poisoning rather than AIDS, he answered, "It's more than possible." August 17, 1989. The government has announced that 1.4 million healthy HIV antibody positive Americans could, quote, benefit from taking AZT, even though they show no symptoms of disease. New studies have, quote, proven that AZT is effective in stopping the progression of AIDS in asymptomatic and early ARC cases. Dr. Fauci, the head of NIH, proudly announced that a trial has been going on for, quote, 2 years, had, quote, clearly shown that early intervention will keep AIDS at bay. Anyone who has antibodies to HIV and less than 500 T4 cells should start taking AZT at once, he said. That is approximately 650,000 people. 1.4 million Americans are assumed HIV antibody positive, and eventually all of them may need to take AZT so they don't get sick, Fauci contended. The leading newspapers didn't seem to think it unusual that there was no existing copy of the study, but rather a breezy 2-page press release from the NIH. When Spin called the NIH asking for a copy of the study, we were told that it was, quote, still being written. We asked a few questions about the numbers, so they go into the specifics here. I'm not going to because that's pretty confusing. So they did this study for 2 years. However, the figures are vastly misleading. When we asked how many patients were actually enrolled for a full 2 years, the NIH said they did not know, but the average time of the participant was 1 year, not 2. Quote, it's terribly dishonest the way they portrayed those numbers, says Dr. Sonnabend. Quote, if there were 60 people in the trial, those numbers would mean something. But if you calculate what the percentage is out of 3,200, the difference becomes minute between the two groups. It's nothing. It's hit or miss. And they make it look like it's terribly significant. The study boasted that AZT is much more effective and less toxic at 1/3 the dosage than has been used for 3 years now. That's the good news. The bad news is that thousands have already been walloped with 1,500 milligrams of AZT and possibly even died of toxic poisoning. And now we're hearing that 1/3 of the dose would have done. With all that remains so uncertain about the effects of AZT, it seems criminal to advocate expanding its usage to healthy people, particularly since only a minuscule percentage of the HIV-infected population have actually developed ARC or AIDS. Boros Wellcome has already launched testing of AZT in asymptomatic hospital workers, pregnant women, and in children who are getting liquid AZT. The liquid is left over from an aborted trial and given to the children because they can mix it with water. Children don't like to swallow pills. It has also been proposed that AZT be given to people who do not yet test positive for HIV antibodies but are, quote, at risk. Quote, I'm convinced that if you gave AZT to a perfectly healthy athlete, says Fedorko, he would be dead in 5 years. Quote, this is such shoddy science, it's hard to believe nobody is protesting. Flash forward, August 17, 1989. Newspapers across America banner headline that AZT had been, quote, proven to be effective in HIV, antibody positive, asymptomatic, and early ARC patients, even though one of the panel's main concerns was that the drug should only be used in last case scenario for critically ill AIDS patients due to the drug's extreme toxicity. Dr. Anthony Fauci, head of the NIH, was now pushing to expand prescription. The FDA's traditional concern had been thrown to the wind. Already, the drug had spread to 60 countries and an estimated 20,000 people. The beneficial effects of the drug had proven to be temporary. The toxicity, however, stayed the same. So what does this mean? If it's true, it means that HIV is not the cause of AIDS, which a lot of scientists and doctors have said, but I guess it was a lot easier to censor back then. Then it was the drugs and not the disease killing people. And who was pushing the drugs? One of the same guys pushing COVID today.
There are all sorts of associations, organizations that hold themselves out as being able to think for you. We are the trade group for this, we are the government regulatory body, we are the professional regulatory body, but how does the individual have the courage to look at that accepted dogma and say, you know what, I'm not buying it?
Distrust your fellow man. I would say that's an important thing. You know, think of him as being just as fallible as you are. You know, it's just like in political scandals. Follow the money trail. Figure out who's getting paid for this.
Fucking stoned.
I got motherfucking spaceship.